and welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain, with Sathnam Sanghera in conversation with Emily Benn. This is a session that explores the reality and legacy of the British Empire. Sathnam Sanghera's latest book, Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain, is a brilliant commentary on the painful history large parts of the world share. Sanghera's narrative focuses on the importance of accepting Britain's imperial past in order to understand its presence and future. In conversation with Emily Benn, Sanghera explores why the existence of the British Empire is often forgotten in modern Britain and underscores the importance of confronting a deeply troubled past. I'm delighted to introduce our guests. Sathnam Sanghera graduated from Christ's College, Cambridge, with a first in English language and literature. He has been shortlisted for the Costa Book Awards twice. His third book became an instant Sunday Times bestseller in 2021, was named a Book of the Year at the 2022 British Book Awards, and inspired Channel 4's Empire State of Mind. Joining him is Emily Benn, a politician, commentator, and social activist based in London. She is an elected member of the City of London Council, representing Bread Street Ward, and has twice stood for Parliament, becoming the UK's youngest ever parliamentary candidate in the process. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us for this, what I know is going to be a fascinating discussion, and not least thanks to Sathnam for writing the book that has really changed things in Britain about how we think about the legacy of the British Empire, its impact on so many aspects of our society, our politics, our culture, many of which I know we'll talk about today. And I'm very keen to have as many perspectives and questions from the audience as we go along. For the many of us that have read Empireland, it's part history, it's part social commentary, it's part memoir. I'm interested in, first, what you were trying to get out of it when you were writing the book and how you came to it, because it's an interesting story as to how it became the book it is.
Yeah, I guess it partly did well because of Black Lives Matter, because that suddenly created a huge interest in colonialism and how that shaped racism around the world. But I started it for other reasons. And when I started it, I don't think many of my friends really understood what I was trying to do, and nor did I. I mean, initially began as me wanting to write a biography of this man called Dean Mohammed, who was the first Indian to write a book in English, and also became very famous in Britain, I think around the early 1800s. And then I realized, whilst researching it, that I knew nothing about empire, even though it explains why we're here, well, why we're in Britain normally, explains our education, explains a lot of Britain's wealth, our psychology, our politics, explains the way the Sikhs see themselves. I'm a Sikh. And our identity was rather quite largely shaped by the British. And I had no idea. And so when I found that out, it turned into a book explaining the basics about empire, but also explaining how Britain itself had been shaped by empire.
Because, I mean, picking up on that, you can read it almost as a kind of collective therapy book for Britain, because the way that so many people instinctively think about it, it's a very emotional reaction that people have to it, whether it's feeling defensive about an attack, whether it's, a kind of collective amnesia. I mean, the range of emotions that you describe throughout the book are quite a few and quite potent, and it must have been an interesting personal emotional journey while doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a general truth that the way people react to any art has got very little to do with the artist. It's about them. And I think a lot of the reactions have been about them. And I think there's one reaction you missed out. There's also been a certain amount of anger from the left wing that I'm not angry enough. That's definitely something that occurs in Britain. But it's the dominant reaction, I guess, apart from people saying, thank you for telling me the basics of British Empire, is anger at me for daring to confront the subject.
And let's be honest, you, writing about the British Empire in Britain, have a certain reaction that other people don't. So JLF's very own, William Dalrymple, who writes in very great detail about many aspects of the British Empire that are deeply shameful, doesn't get the reaction you do. I mean, we can guess why, but it does say something.
Why is that?
Well, it might be something to do with your British Indian heritage, if I could make such a bold assumption. But it does say something about the society that we're living in, that you have to go off Twitter. You know, when your Channel 4 documentary came out, you couldn't look at the internet because of the reactions that you were getting.
Yeah, and actually I don't really do literary events unless I get to come to India, where hopefully the crowd is a little more sympathetic. People come and hate watch me, so they come and shout at me at literary festivals. And it's not always white men in their 70s, though it mostly is. Sometimes it's Indians in their 70s who are very nostalgic about the Raj. But there's something I always like to say at this stage, which is I don't get it anywhere near as badly as black historians. I think David Olusoga gets it much worse than me. And actually, brown women historians get it the worst. But yeah, I mean, I was very grateful for William for saying in an interview that he'd never had a single reaction, racist reaction or angry reaction like I get every day of my life. And yet he's been writing about it for 20 or 30 years. And it was him saying that made me realize that it was abnormal. I think until that point, I thought, this is what happens when you're a journalist, because we all get it, right? But it's been slightly more difficult and more intense than that.
Yeah, and this is a reaction faced by politicians and politics too, and I should say the reaction that women get more generally on social media in any respect is disproportionate and significantly. You know, William, it's interesting because your book, as I mentioned it, it's part history. Do you consider yourself a historian now? I mean, we've had some incredible historians speak over the last few days. Do you think you're one of them?
Actually, I was having this conversation with a historian here, Simon Sebag Montefiore, and actually with Alex Renton as well. And I don't call myself a historian. I say I'm a reader of history. But actually, if you look at the successful historians, a lot of them didn't do history at university. So I did English. I mean, there's people like, I think Tom Holland, I don't know if he's here, but he did English. Jeremy Paxman did English. And I think maybe part of my reluctance to use the historian word is about imposter syndrome. And I think that in itself reflects the fact that until recently, this history has largely been written by white men. And there's a view, I think, that if you're brown, you're not to be trusted with this history. You're going to be too emotional, which is itself is a legacy of empire, that kind of racism. And maybe I should say I'm an historian. Should I?
I think so. I mean, I don't want to speak from another end, but I mean, it has certainly changed the way people think about our history more than many things I can think of. I mean, the impact's been massively significant. And it's interesting how, even in relatively short time, when you started thinking about your book process, I mean, things changed in Britain. You mentioned BLM, but partly it's political because it suits some sides of British politics and politicians to use how we educate people about the British Empire. It suits them politically to create big dividing lines. It's if people keep using the word culture war, but you know, it is really at the forefront of the culture war about how we teach this. But generations are changing about the way they think. And you made the decision to write Empireland as a version for young adults. And I'm interested as to what impact you think that's having and also the changes that you're seeing continuously about how people are grappling with it.
It's really interesting to come here and to come to the territories that Britain colonized, because the gap between the way British people talk about empire and the way the rest of the world talks about it is huge. And we're obsessed in Britain, and there's a certain book out at the moment about claiming that British Empire was nice. And that conversation is not relevant in Barbados, where they're talking about the legacies of slavery. It's not relevant in India. It's not relevant in Mauritius, where I've just been. But we have this insular obsession with the balance sheet view of empire, weighing the railways against massacres. And it's such an absurd way of looking at history. And so I think there's a divide between Britain and the world, but also there's a generational divide. I think, in general, older people are more likely to be defensive of British Empire, I think. But young people, I think, are very animated. They want to know more. They're frustrated. They're not being taught about it at school. They're going to other places to get their information. And this can't be stopped. It's like this demand for information. And but also, I think one other factor is the fact that After British Empire ended, the British went out of the way to destroy the evidence. I mean, there was said to be a pool of smoke over Delhi because they were burning so many documents. And they burned documents everywhere. And I think this is why it's taken so long for the penny to drop even outside Britain, because it's only now that historians are doing research and discovering what happened.
People like Caroline Elkins, who some of us would have seen the session talking about, and we're not talking hundreds of years ago, we're talking about systemic covering up of evidence in the past 50, 60 years. I mean, it's barely history.
And one of the arguments making the book is about how imperial racism created racism in modern Britain. And people are like, how can you make that connection? I was like, well, let's look at what was happening in the 1950s. What were we doing to the Mau Mau? We were killing and torturing them. What were we doing to black people on the streets of London? We were assaulting them and trying to kill them. So there is a connection.
The discussions about decolonization, statues, name changes, this is not a discussion that's just happening in the UK. It's also happening in India here, where we're talking, and would like to get lots of views from the audience on it. But this is related to your next book and your next book project. But it's some interesting parallels about what's happening in Indian politics. Yeah,
and actually around the world. This culture war is not just a British or an Indian thing. I mean, in India, there's a battle over, I guess Modi's trying to decolonize India, but I think he considers the Mughal period also a period of colonization, very controversially. But, Ukraine, what's that about? It's about Russia trying to re-establish its empire, right? You've got similar conversations happening in America too. And I find Modi's, attempts to decolonize New Delhi really fascinating because, building a new parliament, putting up that statue of Bose, but also getting rid of English phrases. And I think that's ultimately impossible because the English language is so baked into India. And I didn't realize until I started researching my next book, which is about how British Empire shaped the planet. I didn't realize that English literature began as a subject in India 50 years before it started being studied in Britain. I found that amazing. And actually, a lot of the kind of study material came from India. I find that, isn't that kind of amazing?
Totally, and totally misunderstood and not known in Britain. We are, as ever, able to woefully misremember our past. But talking briefly about Britain, and forgive me, I like politics, so we'll tended to that subject. But you can't really talk now about British politics without thinking, well, we have a new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Yeah. I noticed, though, he's so small.
He's very short.
You could miss him.
I did meet him a couple of months ago, and I agree. He's not the tallest Prime Minister we've ever had. But there are two, and he's enviably thin, was my other perspective. There are a couple of things I want to ask your perspective on it. Firstly, a lot of the literature and reaction when he was elected was couched in imperial and empire historical terms, in different ways. I don't know if you had any particular thoughts on that, but then the second point was that, and this is really directly related to what you write about in Empireland, Rishi Sunak is often criticised in Britain or taken the mickey out of as head boy character. He's too clever, he's too successful, he's too clever. And as you so brilliantly describe in the book, the kind of anti-intellectual pro-cult of amateurism is completely baked in elements of the British Empire and what it was taught and the culture of it.
Remind me of the second question in case I forget to answer it. But Rishi Sunak, I think two contradictory feelings can be true, valid at the same time. We've got to welcome the fact that we have got an Indian Prime Minister. It's a great thing. I mean, in my lifetime, Indians had shit put to their door, You were called a packy, you were beaten up if you just walked down the wrong street. In my parents' lifetime, they weren't allowed in certain pubs. They weren't allowed to buy houses in parts of Wolverhampton. They weren't allowed to do certain jobs. And now the Prime Minister is Indian, and that has got to be a good thing. The problem is, he's obviously a right-wing Prime Minister, and the policies he's endorsing are not great for people of his family's background, At one point during his election campaign, he said he wanted to refer people who criticised Britain, did Britain down, i.e. people like me and you, by referring them to Prevent, which is the anti-terrorism agency, And so he's taking part of the conservative culture war. And also, his immigration policies are very, illiberal. And they would have stopped people of his grandparents' generation from coming into Britain. And actually, what the government have done with the Windrush scandal, where it admitted it done something deeply racist, it commissioned a report, it said it would fulfill all the conclusions, and now has decided not to under Rishi Sunak. I think that is a massive betrayal of his parents' legacy.
Very fair.
They wouldn't clap in England.
They wouldn't clap. Well, some people would clap in England, but it's a very controversial opinion to have for many people in England, what you've just described. It's very difficult for people to grapple with it. I go back to my point about being such a kind of deeply personal, emotional thing when you talk about it. On the other hand, there were, I don't know about your WhatsApp group, but my WhatsApp groups were full of memes when he was elected. Kind of great pride. For me, it was Remembrance Sunday that it first kind of properly hit me, because there he was at the cenotaph, Luton's. There's so much symbolism, there's so many connections between here but it was Rishi Sunak laying a wreath.
Could you see him?
Yeah, no. Yes, I could see him. It got me weirdly emotional. I should say my mother's Bengali, my dad's unbelievably English, so it was a weird. It hit me then.
Yeah, I think that context is particularly poignant because one of the great amnesias of British Empire and Britain is the fact, we forget the fact, I was never taught about the millions of troops from across Empire and India, the millions of pounds worth of resources that were used to win both world wars. I think it's 3 million imperial soldiers across both.
And India gave donations to
and yet,
of cash.
I think a couple of years ago, we have this guy an actor called Lawrence Fox, who became very famous for becoming angry about the fact that there was a Sikh soldier in the film 1917, which is a film about World War I. He was furious, wokeness. The thing is, there were Sikhs in that war. And
hundreds of thousands.
I remember also Bernard Manning, who's a famous racist comedian, appearing on BBC Two in 1997 and saying, there were no Pakis at Dunkirk. Pakis is a very racist way of referring to all
offensive way
all Asians. And he wasn't wrong in the sense that Pakistan didn't exist at that time. But there were loads of Indians there, and that was on BBC Two. I remember watching it as a sixth former.
How long? Oh, so not that long ago then, you being so young and successful. But
so in that context, Rishi Sunak, putting his wreath down, it's an amazing thing.
Yeah, and being elected just for Diwali and then practicing Hindu. I was watching a brilliant session yesterday, or particularly on Indian soldiers in World War I. Totally fascinating. I like to think I'm not that old, and I studied both the First and Second World War in a classic British education way, that you go from the kind of Tudor period, then the First and Second World War, and you learn a very particular type of it. I think that is changing, but the way that you change the education curriculum, as I said earlier, has been so controversial. When you're trying to persuade people to change their mind, this kind of language matters, and particularly the word decolonize it's like lighting a touch paper. Whereas, broadening or diversifying the curriculum has a very different impact on people. So the way that we talk about this, and if we want to change the conversation, you have to be incredibly detailed about how you talk about it.
Yeah, I think decolonization is a very interesting idea. It's problematic in the sense that it's impossible. Because, we're going to decolonize India. We're going to have to get rid of the wide streets that the British put in, right? We're going to have to get rid of the public squares that were a motif of empire. We have to get rid of the English language. We have to do so many things. British Airways can't fly here because it used to be British Imperial Airways, right? If you start thinking about all the things created by British Empire, it's quite a lot. And it's like trying to take the egg out of a baked cake. You just can't do it. But my other problem with the word is that it really upsets people and makes people very angry. It creates the idea that things are being erased, when actually, for me, what decolonization is, it's about widening things. It's about widening the curriculum, including more Black history, which is British history, and Asian history, including Indian history and world history. And I think it's totally in keeping with the academic tradition, right? But the phrase decolonization suggests the opposite. It suggests, banning Shakespeare and all that crap that people make up in the Daily Telegraph.
Apologies, are there any Telegraph writers in the room?
Also, I think there's a Telegraph newspaper in India, not that one.
Important clarification, but the arguments for education and the political aspects of it are huge. Our ability to kind of have amnesia about things is amazing, and I wonder whether particular aspects of that strike you most heavily as you've been, doing the research.
Yeah, God. Again, I don't think it's something limited to Britain. I think by nature, a nation's history is also things they've collectively decided to forget. If you look at China's version of the Opium Wars, it's pretty weird. It doesn't really relate to what actually happened. But, I mean, one of the most shocking things for me was reading Tony Blair's biography, and he's talking about handing Hong Kong back to the Chinese. We ended up with Hong Kong as a result of the Opium Wars. And he says, I was only dimly aware of the history. It's like, how can you hand back a colony and not know the history? It's so embarrassing. But I think that's fairly typical. I think our politicians don't really know the history, especially of why so many brown people arrived in the 20th century. There's an idea which I internalized that we kind of came uninvited, but actually we arrived as a result of the 1948 Nationality Act originally as citizens of Britain, as citizens of empire.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I was never told that at school. I was growing up under where Enoch Powell, a very racist MP, was ruling the roost. I grew up with a narrative that we came uninvited.
Unfortunately, that has a pervasive impact even now on politics, even when it is quite clear that is not the case. It rears its head in all sorts of different ways in contemporary British political arguments. But if you talk about ignorance, total ignorance of that, I mean, how you treat Ireland in Empireland is interesting, because there are different ways of talking about it, different ways of thinking about it. But I still find it astonishing that I learnt nothing about Britain's relationship with Ireland at school. I mean, our nearest neighbour, causing all sorts of political problems when you talk about Brexit, which I will come on to in a second. But it's the sheer ignorance and lack of knowledge is bizarre, totally bizarre.
I was actually taught quite a lot about Ireland, but no one said it was part of empire. And actually, I think that's a bit, because of the legal complications, some people argue it was an empire. But actually, the Great Potato Famine, where not only I think 1 million people died, but then inspired a great emigration from Ireland to America, and was an important event for America, was an imperial event. And we should see it as that. And it's a really valuable thing, I think, to compare. And I think it'd be really useful to tell school children to compare the Great Potato Famine to the Bengal famine of 1943. I mean, that would be such an interesting thing. And another shocking thing I discovered is that in my hometown, the Punjabi immigrants were subject of all sorts of racism. But 100 years beforehand, in exactly the same streets, there was a wave of Irish immigration. And they had exactly the same racism.
Same reaction.
They said, they're practicing a weird religion. They're not talking English. They drink too much. They're loud. And that's exactly what they said about the Sikhs. We are loud, by the way. So that's true.
You take that one, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those parallels are really important, and we should think about them more.
You've just touched on racism. One of the things that's very striking that you say in Empireland is that the British Empire was an exercise in white supremacy. And that is controversial for a lot of people to hear in Britain. It has got a particular reaction. I wondered if you could talk about that slightly more. Yeah,
I would qualify that saying it was definitely for at least 100 years an exercise in white supremacy. They were proud of the fact. They talked about it. And actually, what I'm discovering from my next book is that there was an international conspiracy, in the sense that the President of the United States was writing to the person running Australia, which has decided to become a white man's country, literally what they called it, was talking to people in South Africa. There was always letters where they were conspiring to introduce laws to stop Asians and black people from settling or encouraging them to leave. But I think in Britain we see ourselves as fundamentally an anti-racist country.
partly thanks to our, again, we will always default, so cliche, go back to talking about the Second World War.
Yes, we beat the evil racist Germans, therefore we can't be racist. Also, we abolished slavery. Also, we gave India democracy and the railways, so we can't be racist.
How kind, yeah. Absolute madness.
But I think I would say that's the standard view in British politics.
I think it's changing.
But
there is a massive generational divide when you talk about it. Even people a decade younger than me, it's massively different the way people think about it. And if you look at social media activism, it is all, the way people think about it and talk about it is incredibly different. So some hope that people are reappraising.
Yeah. But I think the controversy about Winston Churchill and how, he was a racist, but he's also the biggest national hero we have.
Yeah.
But again, two things can be true. He saved liberal democracy. He was a great man and a great hero. At the same time, he was really racist, and too racist even for his colleagues who thought he was over the top.
Yeah.
Both things can be true.
Totally. I mean, for those that watched Tristram Hunt talk about Josiah Wedgwood yesterday, likewise, it's intensely frustrating when you're talking about these people because they are full of total contradictions and you want to cheer for them 1 minute and rage against them the next. But welcome to people, and certainly welcome to political leaders. But just like you said, the reaction from some of his colleagues at the time, I mean, a lot of the cliched response that you get and a lot of the commentary, all the comments I've read is, oh, look, we can't judge the past by today's standards, but the whole bloody point is that people at the time were arguing against it. The idea that this was all some sort of, done thing. I am interested in your view of the Commonwealth. I say this only because, we're in a year that we're going to have a new coronation. I have a feeling that a certain diamond will not be on show in the end on the coronation. I would be astonished if it was. But, it was very associated with our previous monarch. I think our new monarch realises that some of the imperial colonial overtones are not exactly helping Britain's relationship with countries around the world. Does it mean anything to you at all?
I think I went to the Commonwealth Games. Those were quite nice in Birmingham. And it felt like it meant something then, because you're in a city that has been made by empire. And, but yeah, I mean, it's fun. I think Enoch Powell called it a gigantic farce, the Commonwealth, and it kind of is really. I mean, the only thing people have agreed about the Commonwealth is that it lacks meaning. But I think it could find a role for itself if it engaged with this question of post-colonialism, about what we do about these legacies. It could be a forum through which we talk about these questions. I mean, basically, most of the people in the Commonwealth, most of the countries have some experience of empire. Not all of them, weirdly. Rwanda, I think, is part of it now. And you've got the royal family, you've got other parts of the establishment which are struggling to deal with the legacy too. King Charles recently said that he wants to learn more about slavery, which makes me think he's had 70 years. He could have done it earlier. But it's good that he said that.
Better late than never, or, yeah.
So I think you could get him and the Commonwealth together and maybe they could talk about it. The problem is that the political establishment would go crazy and the Daily Telegraph would have a nervous breakdown. So I'm not sure how that's going to happen.
Maybe it needs to have a nervous breakdown. I would love to get some questions and perspectives from the audience. Immediate. Can I ask the man right at the front in the first in the black t-shirt and black hat, and then the young gentleman after. I'll go to you after, but this gentleman first. Thank you.
Ki hal chal hai bhaji?
Sat Sri Akal.
Sat Sri Akal. So, as a fellow Sikh, I want to know your views, the rising fanaticism and extremism in the community, things like referendum 2020 happening in UK, and kind of disillusionment of the youth, Punjabi youth, whether it's in Punjab or in the diaspora at large. So, your views on it, and what kind of backlash are you expecting when Empire World comes out next year?
That's a really difficult question. I haven't worked out I think I don't know enough about it. I would say I used to, believe in India, and I think one of the sad things recently is that it's becoming, sectarian, and you got Hindu nationalists, and one of the beautiful things about India is that Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus all work together. But yeah, one thing I didn't understand was the history. I didn't know that the Sikh numbers were falling in the 19th century. And then the British decided that we were a martial race. You look more like a soldier than I do. But they created this idea, and then we absorbed it, the idea that we're a fighting people, and then numbers began increasing, partly because people converted because they wanted to be favored by the British, and this is the way in which the British have their fingers in every pie, you know? They influence things in such weird ways. But yeah, I've got to say, I'm going to dodge that question about Khalistan.
Okay, Julie.
Okay, sorry. I'll talk to you privately afterwards.
That says something too. Can I ask the young gentleman here at the front, please?
Thank you. I would like to ask, what is the opinion of the general British public about the British Empire? Is it shown in a positive or a negative light?
That's a very good question, thank you. There was a survey done recently of all European nations, and one of the questions was, do you miss your empire? And Britain wasn't the country that missed it the most. It turns out the Dutch are even more nostalgic about their empire than we were. But we were the second most nostalgic. I think it was around 50%, but there was a similar survey done 10 years beforehand, and the numbers are going down. So people are getting less nostalgic about British Empire and maybe learning some facts.
Maybe they've read your book, that's why.
Yeah, well, hope so.
The only thing I would just add is it's people are very cognizant in politics, as you can't get away from it. You totally can't get away from it now.
And the other thing I guess I've missed out here is there's been a huge backlash against children, organisations like the National Trust, historians like David Olusoga and writers like me talking about it, because I don't know what drives them. I think it's partly their families were involved in empire. They feel very defensive about that. It's partly about power and race, because if you say that brown people arrived equally in Britain, then you've got to give up the power. You've got to give up some power to them. And this white establishment doesn't want to. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I think it is true to some degree.
It's also, a kind of big phrase that various governments recently have tried to say is global Britain. We need to go back to global Britain. Now, there's quite a lot of talking about how, great shared history with parts of the world. I mean, some people did better out of that than others, but it's just, you cannot ignore the overtones in that stuff.
Yeah, I think the problem with all these phrases like global Britain is that the world remembers what happened when Britain arrived in boats. Just because we've forgotten, it doesn't change the situation.
No, quite.
That India remembers, and South Africa remembers, and even America remembers quite vividly what happened. So there's disconnect.
Quite a popular musical, I think, that talks about the American experience.
Yeah, I think the American thing is really interesting. I think the Americans forget that, when the Boston Tea Party happened, the tea being thrown into the harbour was tea from the East India Company, from China. And actually, it was an imperial dispute, really, about taxes. And I think America likes to think of itself as an enemy of British Empire, but it was created by British Empire. It was part of the 13 colonies were a phase of British Empire. And I think America has been shaped in all sorts of ways by British Empire, not least, I think, in the way every baddie in every Hollywood film is played by a British person. Have you noticed? Even when they're
Alan Rickman, I can go through them all.
Even when they're a German Nazi, it's a British person playing it.
I hadn't thought about it. I have to go back through my catalogue. Can I have the gentleman first in the blue in the front, and then I'll go to the back. Sorry, I won't just do the front.
Yeah. Could you tell me what do you think of the writings of my favorite writer, Jan Morris, on the Empire?
Oh, right.
And are you related to Tony Benn? That's my second question.
Oh.
Not you.
Oh, yeah, I'm not. But
Are you related to Tony Benn?
weird, we never talked about this. Emily is related. She's the granddaughter of Tony, and also she's part Bengali, and crucially. She's one of you. One of us. I don't know. Jan Morris, yes. I should explain who she was. She was a Times journalist who was James Morris and then had a sex change and became Jan Morris. And she wrote a famous trilogy about empire. It was called Pax Britannica. and it's an amazingly written book, but it's very nostalgic about empire, and she admitted that. And it's a book that's heavily studied at Eton, our most famous school, which I think explains the empire nostalgia amongst people like David Cameron and Boris Johnson. But interestingly, she died last year, and she gave it one of her last interviews. She said she was really ashamed of the book. And I was like, oh my God. First of all, that reflects her intellectual and kind of psychological flexibility. Very few writers do that. People get defensive normally, but she more or less said she got it wrong, which is, I think, revealing.
Yeah, heaven knows things would be better if people were more willing to accept when things are wrong and things need to change.
Although we had, actually I'm not going to say that because this is being videoed. I'll stop there.
Oh, you can't, I mean, that's leaving...
Okay, I'll go. There's another historian called Andrew Roberts who is very pro-empire now. He's in the House of Lords. Boris Johnson put him there. He's very fond of empire. But he gave an interview earlier on in his career where he said, oh, I only started defending the empire because I thought it would get people's attention. I don't really believe it. And I'm wrong. So, but then he went back to his old position.
And the consequences we are living through right now. Can I go to the your second question? I am related to Tony Benn. Yeah. Yes, I am. I am. And it's when his father was, I find it ridiculous, his father was called Secretary of State for India for 2.5 years. Bizarre, you're running India from London, and my mother's family was somewhere outside Dhaka and then had to move to outside Calcutta. So it's a weird mix.
So we should explain that he was a very famous left-wing
Yeah,
MP.
he was a famous left-wing and massively anti-colonial. Not just saying that because of the audience here. He really was. Can I go to the... there's a woman in the blue shirt there, and then a man in a hat over there.
I'm interested to know, what does a utopian Britain look like to you? And I'm interested to know tangibly and in an abstract sense.
Wow, a utopian Britain. Well, one that is at ease with its history, one that accepts historians. And one of the weirdest things of this culture war is that you've got people, some of them historians, attacking organizations for doing history. It's like, if you're so proud of British imperial history, why are you stopping historians from researching it? It's such a weird paradox. So, and I think that's probably true for India as well. You want a country where historians can do their research and not be condemned and not have to hide and not be trolled endlessly about it. I think in terms of history, that is something I'd like to see. I'd like to see a broader curriculum that reflects the multicultural diversity of Britain, rather than, in my case, being endlessly taught about the 100 Years' War, which wasn't 100 years long. Did you know that?
I know, it's been misnamed.
Yes, 116 years.
Easier to remember, though, 100 Years' War, 116 Years' War. Can I go to the gentleman in the hat? You with the red, as you've been gesticulating wildly, so I'd feel terrible if I didn't go to you.
Thank you. I was in London recently and discovered that there's this council estate in Islington, which was named after the heroes of the mutiny of 1857. So it is the Delhi Outram estate, and then the Islington Council clearly saw fit in the 1970s to name the new streets after people like Luck and I forget, Vibart, who I'd never heard of, who was apparently a chronicler of the mutiny and its excesses on the side of the Indians. So I'm curious if there are other examples that you've come across of when people say, this is all ancient history, it's a long time ago, and yet, in the 70s and the 80s, they were sort of erecting things to honor the heroes of a massacre and a genocide and other stuff like that.
That's a very good question. Actually, I've got a very good example, because in Southall, which is a very Asian area, very Sikh, if you go to Heathrow Airport, it's staffed by a lot of Sikhs. It makes me feel very warm to go back there, because it's my people. There's a street that was named after one of the generals, I think, who clamped down on the mutiny. And recently it was changed to Guru Nanak Road, after the temple on the street. And there's outrage about this. How dare this happen? And my point about this is, look, you've got one road in Britain named after a Sikh guru. Actually, any Sikhs. One. Don't you think our contribution to this country deserves one road? And there are still lots of roads like that one you mentioned, named after famous British generals. So I think we deserve that one road. Don't you think?
Obviously.
But then, interestingly, and this relates to maybe the question you asked, then there was a backlash among Sikhs who said, oh, people drink alcohol on that street and they do bad things. It's bringing the religion into disrepute. And it kind of demonstrates how you can never really win.
You can never win. That's the ultimate. I think there's a gentleman here, he's got a mask on. You've equally been waving.
Thanks. I have a sort of tricky question, a dangerous one. This whole debate about reparations and that the monarchy should apologize, is the apology in itself so small that it might actually disrespect the memories of partition and everything that happened here? Do you think that needs to be, just how would you balance that?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think it's Holland, isn't it? Netherlands have recently apologized, and it's resulted in, I think, a member of the royal family, was it Belgium? It's one of those European countries, sorry, has apologized. And now there's been a backlash against the apology. Like, this means nothing unless you produce money, unless you return the artifacts. And I think that's true. There's no arguing with that. But what you've got to understand about Britain is that we're not even at the stage of having the conversation. There's a conversation about reparations in America. Biden and Kamala Harris have both talked about it. They've talked about the numbers. In Britain, it's hard to explain just how far away we are from that, maybe 50 years from thinking about the amounts involved, right? So given that, I just think, I think we've never even apologized for a single imperial atrocity. We've had Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, apologise.
Yeah, some individuals.
And as part of the Good Friday Agreement with Ireland, we had politician Tony Blair apologising. We had the Queen apologising. So we can do it. But we're so far away from that. Actually, I think it's best not to talk about reparations. We just need to start talking about what happened. And maybe the question of saying sorry about Jallianwala Bagh. I mean, it's been 100 years now, and we still can't say sorry.
There's a lady there right next to the microphone, conveniently.
So I had a follow-up question about reparation. Now, recently, the Meghan and Harry story has just completely exposed how really non-globalized the core civilizational value of Great Britain is. If you listen to the Meghan story, there's also a desire by the colonies to get their prized precious stones back. So Narendra Modi wants the Kohinoor back, I think, and South Africa is also looking to get its own diamond back. There seems to be, like Britain right now is under a pressure cooker of a lot of questions. It's interesting they've pulled an Indian on top of their game maybe to handle that, but there's an energy crisis, there's a moral crisis that's going to be a consequence. Do you see some kind of karmic retribution going on right now?
Fantastic question.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
That's a good way. I mean, I think actually it's not a bad way of looking at it, because Britain decolonized this empire. It decolonized what it owned, but it hasn't never decolonized itself. And actually, it was interesting that the Queen, died in Scotland. At the start of her life, I think when she was made Queen, she found out in Kenya, a part of empire, and she died in Scotland. And Scotland, of course, is a country that might break away from Great Britain. So we're at the risk of losing the Union. So we once ruled a quarter of the world, and now we're going to struggle to even keep the country together. And I think there's something in that idea. As for Meghan and Harry, I'm glad it's translated into India. It's basically a Bollywood story, isn't it? It's the evil mother-in-law. Actually, I'd be interested to know, in India, are you Team Harry or Team William? Well, you put up your hands. Okay, so who is Team Harry? Okay, so who's Team William? Harry wins. Harry wins.
I was really wanted to not talk about Harry, but it's again, I just too much. But it's good to know that the multiple crises in Britain have captured international attention. Things are not exactly going well in Britain, given we had a prime minister that was outlasted by the shelf life of a lettuce. It's embarrassing, let's put it that way. But a good way to conceptualize it. We've got time for one more question. That man is stood up, leapt to his feet. So, the gentleman in front of him.
Yeah, I think we can get two of them.
Oh, okay, both of you. The microphone is coming.
Thank you both for this wonderful session, and thank you especially for including the story of Ireland in the discussion and the imperial relationship we had with our esteemed neighbours. I wanted to ask you about something that is a troubling development in recent years, and on the right wing of the Conservative Party, people like Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, who are some of the most strident voices against immigration and the plight of refugees who are trying to get across the channel on kayaks and all sorts of things, and drowning in the process. And I'd love to hear actually from both of you, what is your take on that depressing and heartless phenomenon? Thank you for taking my question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and yeah, it's a very depressing state of affairs. I always quote my friend Nesrin Malik, who writes for The Guardian, and he says, "You can make it to the top of Britain now, whatever colour you are, as long as you agree when you get there that you will leave everything unchanged." You know, and that's really bleak. And we've had Sara Avasi, a Conservative former chair of the party, saying she knows that brown people, Asians, black people join the Conservative Party, want to become candidates, but they can't reveal their full selves, what they actually believe, because of this culture war. And I don't think that is anti-racism, is it really?
No. I'm so profoundly depressed by it, I can barely talk about it. But on a related point, all I can say is that there are huge problems with anti-racism, racism on the British left too, that is very uncomfortable for some people to grapple with. We have had very obvious recent examples of how people are still blighted and unable to reflect the reality of the racism that is on the British left, that it's in no way the same as Priti Patel and Suella Braverman. I mean, to have a Home Secretary say her dream is to send people to Rwanda is a depressing way to end this conversation. I cannot thank you all enough for coming to listen. I can't thank Sathnam enough for writing this incredible book that's changed things.
Thank you for coming.
Much.
We would like to thank Sathnam Sanghera and Emily Benn for this riveting session. Authors will be signing their books at the desk located just outside the hall.
There